Hi, hello. Mein Name ist René Freudenthal und das hier ist Kann, Company, der transatlantische Podcast des Karl-Schurz-Hauses, Insidern auch bekannt als das Deutsch-Amerikanische Institut in Freiburg. Alle paar Wochen packen wir hier 2 Gespräche zu einem gemeinsamen Thema in eine pralle Folge. Eins mit einem amerikanischen Autor oder einer Autorin, einem Experten oder einer Expertin aus den USA oder auch einer Künstlerin oder einem Künstler von der anderen Seite des großen Teichs. Das andere mit einer spannenden, schlagfertigen Person vor Ort, die dazu Stellung bezieht, eigene Eindrücke mitbringt und mit mir thematisch den Sack zuschnürt, wie man so schön schnöde sagt. Für eine Standortbestimmung amerikanischer Außenpolitik nach Joe Bidens Amtsantritt, auf der Suche des Polit-Veteranen nach einer neuen Positionierung der USA, auf dem internationalen Parkett zu Verbündeten und Widersachern, kann es kaum eine geeignetere Analystin geben als Suzy Hansen. In ihrem Debüt Notes on a Foreign Country zeigt die Pulitzer-Finalistin und Princeton-Dozentin, wohin die letzten 20 Jahre US-Diplomatie und amerikanischer Sicherheitspolitik geführt haben und verbindet das mit ihrer bewegten Lebensgeschichte als Expat in der Türkei und im Nahen Osten. Mit uns sieht Hansen voraus, was die nächsten 4 Jahre bringen könnten. Ihr erstes Buch gewann den Overseas Press Club Cornelius Ryan Award for Best Nonfiction Book on International Affairs 2018. Sie schreibt große Reportagen für das New York Times Magazine und arbeitet an einem zweiten Buch über die neuen Ambitionen der Türkei im Wandel und Syriens Bürgerkrieg. Zweiter Gast ist unsere wunderbare Praktikantin Hannah aus Berlin, selbst eine absolute Weltenbummlerin und eine echte Außenpolitik-Afficionada. Schön, dass ihr euch eingeschaltet habt und viel Spaß mit Kann, Company. So good to have you, Suzy Hansen.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So, you have lived in Turkey for a number of years and traveled to Greece, to Egypt, Afghanistan, Iraq and Iran, just in time while you were researching and writing your first book, Notes on a Foreign Country. Constant travel seems central and irreplaceable for your work, I think. And as a book author and as a foreign correspondent, could you tell us a little bit about how the last 16 months of the COVID pandemic, of course I'm going to start with that, have impacted the way you travel and also the way you work?
It had a huge impact in lots of surprising ways. I mean, actually, I had decided that after living in Istanbul for 11, 12 years that I would like to spend at least a year in the United States again, because as you might imagine, I started to feel I didn't understand the US anymore, and particularly after the election of Trump, I was very curious what it was like in the country again. And also I had lived abroad for so long that it felt like it was time to come home. So in the fall of 2019, I moved back to the United States to do some teaching fellowships. And that was supposed to be a kind of happy year of teaching and exploring things. And then, of course, the pandemic hit when I was in Princeton, New Jersey, where I was teaching. So in a small town in New Jersey, which is where I'm from, but Princeton is very different from the town I grew up in. So it was a bit of a shock because suddenly I had to decide, am I going to go back to Turkey? Where is my home exactly? You know, where should I stay for this pandemic? And so I ended up actually staying in the States for the most of the year. I didn't travel in 2020, obviously, and I was getting to know the country again in a very strange circumstance, which is, you know, I had never lived with Donald Trump before. I had never sat in America watching him on TV and all of that. And I was actually shocked because no matter how much I read about it from afar, it was really a much, much different experience from actually being in the country, feeling that precarity and vulnerability of having this man as president. So I think that there were a number of things. I mean, it was such a tumultuous year. There were also obviously the Black Lives Matter protests, which were, I think, in some ways invigorating for a while in terms of feeling like, you know, the country's coming alive again. But of course, it was also very scary. So I think how it has impacted me ultimately in terms of traveling, though, is that I feel a little bit even more caught between two countries because I'm here now in the United States. I feel like I'm still making this transition, and the transition from living in a place like Turkey to back home is a difficult one, I won't lie. So I'm still going to maintain my relationship to Turkey, obviously, because it's such a huge part of my life.
That's actually a perfect way to segue into the next question and into the book as well, because it is such an unhappy coincidence, but also one with global repercussions. Because to me, your first book, which was released in 2017 and shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize in 2018, was a kind of pioneer, I would say, of a newly popular genre, which could be called a geopolitical memoir almost. So you tell the story of your coming of age abroad and finding a new identity as an American expat in Istanbul. But you also tell the story of your own experience of the great and radical influence and power of your own country that it has imposed on other parts of the world. And this comes together in the book in very surprising and innovative ways, I think. And now we see these books much more often. So did this hybrid kind of storytelling come natural to you? And do you think it has something to do with the state of the world when you wrote the book in those years?
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Very interesting question. Yeah, I think that, first of all, the idea for the book came not from me. It came from friends who were listening to me talk about my first years in Turkey and everything that I was learning. And I thought at that point I was going to write a book about Turkey. And they said, no, we think your book is about America, because they were hearing me say all of these things about how America seemed from abroad and what I was learning about American power. And I think that they thought that that was the more interesting book. I did not have the confidence to write that book at that time, because it seemed like that was not what I was supposed to do as a foreign correspondent. I was supposed to write about Turkey, not about myself. But I think that the emotional impact of living abroad and truly understanding the impact of American power was actually the one that was more meaningful to me. But I wanted, the thing is, at first I was going to sort of interview people, foreigners in all of these countries that I went to about the way that American power had impacted them. But soon enough, because I was doing so much reading, I realized that, the rest of the world has been telling America this for a very, very long time in literature and journalism in all kinds of ways. And that the thing I really had to figure out was what was going on with the American psyche and why there was this disconnect between American power and the individual. And I think, as I was reading these books from the 50s and 60s that I think were more hybrid type books. Like, I think we've gotten away from these books a little bit. And I also felt like if I was going to, address something like a psychology, like the American psychology, I needed to fuse a lot of different things together. It was not just a memoir. It was also about history. It was also, I wanted to give the reader, some of these historical episodes that maybe they hadn't had the time or the chance to learn about. It was also about literary, analysis. It was also about understanding kind of propaganda and cultural influence. And so it needed to be this hybrid kind of book. And I also think as a writer, that was just more fun. It was more to be able to move between genres a little bit was an interesting task. But I think it's interesting what you said about geopolitical memoir, because I think that I was living in New York before I moved to Istanbul, and there were a lot of memoirs. There were a lot of, the United States has produced a lot of memoir writing, and it was often about romance, and it was often about finding yourself and self-discovery. And I felt like that was such an American thing, that what about a memoir that connects the self to the empire or to the meaning of the country, all of those things. And is that something that hasn't really been done quite yet? And I think that as a young writer, I felt this pressure to come up with something new. And so that's what I was trying to do.
You have once said that you ended up in Istanbul, not the worst place to end up in an apartment overlooking the Bosporus, no less. Because it was, as the book makes clear, a kind of last-minute decision in a way for such a momentous thing to do. So from hindsight, does it feel a little more like a dance with destiny to you? Or is it still like a romantic and dreamy decision? Or does it feel more rational to you now when you look back at it?
I don't know if any of those words apply, because if I'm truly honest, look, the book is a memoir, but it's also a bit of a construction, right? Like the narrator is me, but it's also very much a constructed narrator to tell a certain story. So I chose certain details of my life. I left certain ones out because I was trying to create this kind of everyman American narrator. And, I think that if it were to be really that kind of confessional style memoir, I mean, the truth is, I think you can tell this from the intro, I was extremely unhappy in New York, and I think that I felt very strongly that intellectually I needed to leave the United States in order to become a more intelligent human being who understood the world better. But I think also, from an emotional point of view, I just very much wanted to leave. I felt like I couldn't really, I think some of us feel like we can't necessarily become ourselves in the place where we grew up or where we're from. So, I mean, I think that there is a very personal element to that. And I applied for this fellowship somewhat on a whim. That is true. I obviously wanted to leave, but where was I going exactly? I think what's interesting about it is that I chose Turkey because of James Baldwin. I didn't choose Turkey because of some long-standing obsession with Turkish culture, which I was ashamed to admit because I thought, well, a serious person moves to a foreign country because they have like this deep linguistic interest or this deep cultural, even culinary interest, anything. But mine was because of James Baldwin, really, truly, because he was, at that point in my life, the only thinker that really, or he was the most prominent thinker who was really sticking with me and making it, he really got under my skin. And the fact that he had lived in Istanbul made me want to go to Turkey. So, I mean, there is something romantic about that, I guess. But I think it's kind of, it really could have been a mess, because I the first years I was there, I really didn't know how to be a foreign correspondent. I was kind of casting around, and my obsession with James Baldwin seemed at that time a little bit, not like silly, but just like, what was I going to do with that? Because at that point, he hadn't really experienced his resurgence that we see today in the culture. And what did anyone care what I thought about James Baldwin? But luckily, yes, I guess it's this kind of lesson that if you follow these deep passions, you can make something out of them, and like that is also why the book is this hybrid, because I knew James Baldwin had to be in there and he had to be the guide. And that was also something I think a little bit unconventional about the book at first. Yeah.
Maybe I was just projecting because the first time I went to Istanbul was a few days after Christmas and it snowed and it was just magical. So maybe the romantic experience was mine.
Oh, let me just say, I mean, I feel like obviously I was the luckiest person in the world for having chosen Istanbul. I mean, and I fell in love with it and I stayed there and felt deeply, I was very, very interested in everything about the country and still am. But yes, I mean, I moved to the most magical city in the world, still my favorite city. And of course I was told by people that how wonderful it was. But I had never been there when I moved there, so I didn't know.
So now comes a very German question, but of course it's of importance to Americans as well. I was wondering if you think that wrestling with the way one's own country engages with the world is a kind of necessary and typical way of coming of age and finding out who one is, or do you think that depends entirely on personality? And is it more urgent when that country is America, which is or was, up until a few years ago, the world's last and only global superpower?
I think it should be. I don't know what it's like for people from other countries, but I think that the thing is, Americans have traditionally, when they're going through this process of figuring out who they are, it is very detached from the country in a way. And I think this is like one of the bizarre things about the United States, because part of the idea of being American is that you are this individual and you are your own island and you create yourself and you are completely independent of these larger forces in the world. I mean, this is what our literature tells us. This is what everything tells us, that in fact, it's not very common for people to kind of try to understand the way that the country has created them, or it's not very common for them to wrestle with the meaning of the country in the world. And I think that foreign correspondents go through this, or maybe aid workers, people who move abroad. I had a number of people say to me like, oh, you basically wrote a book about the experience that we all have, but you wrote a book about it. But I think that, there's something that was something that I very much wanted to investigate in the book, is like this detachment from global power and this detachment from foreign policy, and why people don't think it has anything to do with who they are as individuals. And that was something that I think might be unique about the US. I don't know. I don't know what you think.
I mean, I posed it as a very German question, of course, because it's so ingrained, at least for my generation and the ones before that you had to wrestle with our grandparents' generation and what they did to the world, basically.
Yeah, of course. At one point, one of my many ideas for my first book was one of them was a comparative book about, 20th century German history, British history, and American history, like the way that all three countries wrestle with their historical legacies. But I didn't do that one.
Interesting. I hope you still do, though.
I wish someone would.
So, here comes a weird question that's good after a German question. In reading about your literal and metaphorical journey of understanding Turkey and then the Middle East, once you ventured out more and more, once you had moved there, I kept thinking about a very short and in Germany very famous short story by Franz Kafka, which concerns a mouse which complains to a cat that the more it travels into the outside world, that world which at first seemed so wide, narrows and narrows, and the cat replies, famous words in German, that the mouse only needs to change the direction it travels in, and then it eats it. So does this very metaphorical fable seem relevant to the story you tell in that book?
Yeah, I think that, what the process that I went through that was, and it was a very bewildering one, was that, of course, I felt so grateful and lucky and enthralled to have moved abroad, to be, learning so many new things every day, to have this gift or this task of trying to understand Turkey, for example. And I was in this state of kind of euphoria about that until all of a sudden I just completely crashed, because I was kind of recognizing that I was incapable of doing this, that there were certain reasons why my own mind, my own worldview were limiting me from fully understanding other people, from understanding other countries, and from reckoning with America's history. And this was the point at which I felt like this book had to be one in which it was less a coming of age than a kind of tearing down of, kind of deconstruction of one's mind, of tearing your mind kind of apart and trying to build yourself up again so that you can see the world differently. And, the thing is that at some point while working on the book, because there is a strand in the book that is about being a journalist or the task of foreign correspondence or American foreign correspondence. And I really got myself to the point where I felt I can't do this. Like, actually, when you fully grapple with how biased you are, how, limited your perspective is, you start to feel like, well, why am I writing about a foreign country? Why should it be me? It shouldn't be me. That we should have Turkish people writing about Turkey. It just, you kind of get yourself to a point where you feel like you can't do justice to the reality or to the truth. And, I think it was just practical necessity, having to make a living, that kept me in this profession, because I really felt at some point that there was a lot of damage that a foreign correspondent could do. And that was a sort of painful realization. Yeah.
I can tell you such doubts have never, ever befallen any German reporter reporting about the US, but that's an aside.
Well, I've had people say to me these thoughts, because I've said this before, also these don't occur to many male.
Yes, I tried not to say that, but you're probably right. So another way your book was pioneering in, I think, and you've mentioned him already, is in its very modern and very updated way of appreciating the American writer and essayist James Baldwin, and the critical way he looked at the United States as a racist and colonial society, and America as a nation self-deluded with ideas of its own innocence. A few years later, after your book came out, a whole Baldwin renaissance has swept the globe, and many people are reading him again all over the world. When we do events where just actors read out his text, 150 people show up, and it's insane. So did that come as a surprise to you, or did you see it coming all along?
I didn't know that, for example. That's extraordinary. No, it doesn't surprise me, because to me it's so obvious that he is our best, the best American writer. I just don't know anyone else quite like him. And I think that when I was going through, my early years of love of James Baldwin, I was always meeting people who also felt the same way, and including non-Americans. I wonder if he went through a renaissance also in the 90s or the early 2000s that, just wasn't as big as this one. But it's really extraordinary. There was the documentary, and there was this incredible book that came out last summer called Begin Again, Eddie Glaude, which I really, really recommend, because that puts his ideas in context with a lot of other Black thinkers and really brings his ideas to the present. That book also tackles this question, actually, to why this Renaissance is happening now and why he went through a period where he wasn't as popular, is because he was dismissed at the time by a lot of critics as being too angry. And Eddie Glaude really explores actually what was going on there, and it's very insightful. I agree with Dr. Glaude that a lot of his best works were actually during this supposed angry phase, but I think it was white critics who just couldn't really handle what was going on there. But, you know, for me, it was the age that I read him. You know, I had just graduated from college, and it's like he was the first person who told me what it meant to be a white person. And I was so angry myself that it had never occurred to me that I needed to know that. You know, it's like this kind of stuff. I wasn't surprised, but I'm happy to see it.
For the final stretch, of course, I would like to venture into current politics. Your first book, about which we talked about, came out a few months after President Trump entered office, I think, and foresaw many things about how at least half of America looks and doesn't look at the outside world. That became much more apparent, I would say, in the years since then. Now we are a few months into another presidency, and the unavoidable catchword of the Biden doctrine of foreign policy is beginning to pop up more and more. So what do you make of this new approach to the world, and do you think change or unexpected continuities seem more important?
I think that it's too hard to know right now, first of all. I mean, one thing that has always frustrated me very much with American foreign policy is that the rhetoric is so obfuscating. I mean, we never really talk about it, and it's not really published that much in the media, what is actually happening in terms of the nuts and bolts of the foreign policy. And so, you know, he can say whatever he wants to say, and Jake Sullivan can also, but we will see what it actually means later. So it's very, very hard for me to, you know, there are certain gestures towards ending the war on terror. You see this, what looks like it's going to be a really catastrophic pullout from Afghanistan, not saying that I don't necessarily think we should be pulling out from Afghanistan, but you know, I think a truly revolutionary foreign policy, although that might be too much to ask, would be one in which we really had a national reconsideration of the war on terror. I mean, I think that that's what needs to happen for the realm of foreign policy to quote unquote sort of heal. So much damage has been done. It has transformed so many lives. It has transformed almost people's sense of reality, what Islam means, what the Muslim world means. I really think that in order to recover from that, the president would have to make that like on his national agenda. And I don't really see that happening. So I'm not really sure what to say in that regard. I think that we'll see what happens. I think that obviously it's better having a president who actually knows where countries are and knows the general. I mean, you know, this is the kind of problem with this, is that many of us Americans obviously feel much better that Joe Biden is president. And my concern always was that we would be so relieved that we would be a little bit lazy about what we demand from him. But, you know, domestically, he's been really much more progressive than anyone expected. So I think that the one realm that really remains more or less the same between the two parties is foreign policy. So we don't know yet if he's going to make some grand strides there.
Yeah, you already mentioned it, but I'm still going to go there because it connects so well to the book and to a later chapter in it that really stayed with me. One of the most unforgettable episodes in the book is your visit to Kabul, wrecked by American war in several slightly absurd states of being at the same time. I would say eclectic, irredeemably changed by the way America engages in the world. And to me, that's actually where the world narrative of the book finally overpowers the personal narrative, but in a very good and productive way, I think. Afghanistan, as you've mentioned, is on everybody's minds again these days. So what do you make of this uncertain period? It's happening right now in very weird and concerning ways, of course, leaving overnight basically, and the way of ending this 20-year war.
leaving overnight, and I guess you saw the news that they turned off the electricity and
Yes.
didn't Bagram and didn't let them know. I mean, that's like such a classic detail of American empire. It's really awful. It's one of these things where I just keep thinking of a book that I refer to in my book, No Good Men Among the Living, by Anand Gopal, which is about the earlier years in the Afghan war. And basically all of the mistakes were made. In the very first year, they had no idea what they were doing. And I think that this is what's frustrating for the future. There would have to be this really proper reckoning with the fact that Americans have no idea how to do this, or they have no real intention of nation building, that they're terrible at it, that it's almost on the level of the absurd. And yet the language that we use in order to discuss this never really gets to that real meat of it. I think we're really kind of still stuck in this like American exceptionalist rhetoric where we can't just be more honest about our failures. So here's the problem with watching what's happening in Afghanistan right now. I don't think that anyone thinks that we're going to fix this. I mean, none of the words I can use can really even address the problem at hand. But it is horrifying every day to read a new article about, what is happening to that country. And I just hope that there's some way to discuss why it was such a horrific failure, and I do wonder, okay, is this the right time, I guess, or would there ever be a right time? I don't know.
Yeah. Before I venture for the last bit into your new book with you, I would like to recommend someone who has tried to think about how to get unstuck from this exceptionalism trap, which is Stephen Wertheim. You have probably heard of him. Tomorrow the World is his book, which tries to sketch out a new foreign policy for the US. And I've just talked with him for one of our online events a few weeks ago and came away very impressed.
Oh, yeah, I love him too. I mean, I think the Quincy Institute is one of the most interesting developments in thinking about American foreign policy. I think that's really a very heartening development, and he's a wonderful, wonderful writer.
Yeah. And you're also writing another book on a changing Turkey. That's mainly about Istanbul and how Turkey has changed. Can you give us a little teaser into what's to expect there?
Well, the problem I faced after my first book is that I had kind of talked myself out of writing about a book about Turkey. But then, I had gone to this one little neighborhood in a very conservative part of Istanbul because I heard a lot of Syrian refugees had moved there, and I knew this neighborhood had a bad reputation. It was kind of known for mafia, and it was known for thieves, and it was known for drugs. And I was like, how is this going for the Syrians? And so I went to write a magazine story about it. And around that time, a lot of people weren't really paying attention to the fact that Turkey was it was sort of like, oh, Turkey's taking in so many refugees. That's great. But no one was really thinking about or writing about, how it was going and how the Turkish people were dealing with it, how Erdogan was dealing with it exactly. So I was very curious about that. I knew that Turks, in fact, some Turks were quite prejudiced against Arabs. Actually, there was, in the Western media, you'd hear like, oh, the two Muslim countries, they should be able to get along, blah, blah, blah. But, obviously, if you look at the history, it's much, much more complicated. But on the other hand, you have this other aspect of Turkish Istanbul neighborhoods in particular, where there's this kind of mutual aid and this way that they are forced to get along with each other because they are living in such close proximity. So I was really curious to see how that would all work. And then I just really loved the neighborhood and the history of the neighborhood. And of course, what I found was that, like all Istanbul neighborhoods, they have seen multiple waves of migration over the 20th century, as so many countries have. A lot of the people also in this neighborhood had migrated to Germany and back. And so I wanted to place the Syrian refugees in this kind of larger, longer history, and thought that this was a way of talking about Turkey that maybe is outside of the Islam versus secularism way, like migration prominently shaped the history of this country. But also, these years happen to be like very tumultuous years in Turkish history. This was 2015 to 2019. Erdogan was becoming much more authoritarian. There was a military coup. ISIS was in the country. I mean, it was just so much. the academics were being thrown, being fired, the journalists were being thrown in jail. And I was very curious, like, okay, how does this play out on the street? What does this look like at the street level? People who are just dealing with this vastly changing country and this leader who's changing so rapidly. So that's what it's about. A little bit of everything.
That sounds amazing, actually, at least to me, but I'm sure to many people, because after I went to Istanbul for the last time in winter of 2014 and never went back, and everything happened, which you described, I kept thinking about how the country must have changed and how people must have coped with it. So I'm looking forward to that. So this has been a delight, Suzy Hansen. Thank you so much for coming on.
It was a delight for me too. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Wie schön, dass du da bist, liebe Hanna.
Ja, vielen Dank, dass ich hier sein darf.
Du warst mit dabei beim Interview mit Suzy Hansen und hast uns ein bisschen zugehört. Und mich haben nach dem Gespräch 2 Halbsätze verfolgt, die sie gleich in ihrer Antwort auf die erste Frage gesagt hat, die, glaube ich, nicht nur auf die Corona-Pandemie, über die wir am Anfang gesprochen haben, zutreffen, sondern auch auf den Zustand der Welt vielleicht, auf den welthistorischen Moment, an dem wir gerade stehen. Und diese beiden Halbsätze sind "Where is my home exactly?" und "Caught between two countries." Das sind so Zustandsbeschreibungen, ganz schlicht, aber auch ganz vielsagend. Was geht dir durch den Kopf, wenn du über diese beiden Halbsätze nachdenkst?
Ja, das ist interessant. Als sie das im Gespräch selber ausgesprochen hat, dachte ich, das kommt mir ziemlich bekannt vor. Where's my home exactly? Und ich glaube, dass sich das viele junge Menschen, ehrlich gesagt, heutzutage fragen, die ja eben nicht nur an einem Ort oder in einem Land gelebt haben, sondern durch die Weltgeschichte tingeln. Und bei mir war es ganz interessant, dass ich mir die Frage auch ganz, ganz lange gestellt habe, bis zu dem Moment, als ich im Auslandssemester in Indien war, Anfang 2020, und es dann plötzlich klar war, dass Indien in den Lockdown geht, dass die Uni schließt. Und da musste ich überhaupt nicht überlegen, wo mein Home ist, sondern da war die Gut-Reaction ziemlich schnell da. Und deswegen spannend, dass solche krassen Ereignisse wie jetzt zum Beispiel die Corona-Pandemie auch solche Fragen, sehr persönliche Fragen, auf einmal ganz schnell und instinktiv klären.
Ich habe es ganz am Anfang gesagt und es kam auch im Gespräch mit Suzy Hansen auf, worüber sie schreibt und was wir vielleicht auch gerade auf eine wieder andere Art erleben, ist eine Blickwechselgeschichte. Also gerade das Ausgesetztsein an einem neuen Ort zwingt einen zu einem Blickwechsel, vielleicht auf das eigene Land, auf die Position, die das eigene Land in der Welt einnimmt. Das ist bei einer Supermacht wie Amerika natürlich nochmal eine ganz andere Nummer. Aber als Deutsche, die sich quasi auch mit der Geschichte des eigenen Landes auseinandersetzt, ihr ganzes Leben lang wahrscheinlich schon, wie es uns allen geht, empfindest du das nochmal als eine ganz besondere Herausforderung im Ausland?
Ja, auf jeden Fall. Und ich finde, dass man vielleicht als Deutsche da besonders bewandert ist, was das Aussetzen mit der eigenen Geschichte angeht. Aber ich glaube, also dass das eigentlich primär auf das Dritte Reich quasi anspielt, dass da die Geschichtsaufarbeitung in der Schule und in der Gesellschaft schon in breiter Masse passiert ist. Aber wenn wir über die deutsche Kolonialgeschichte sprechen, da ist das ja nochmal ein ganz anderes Thema. Und das ist schon, glaube ich, wenn du deine eigenen 4 Wände verlässt und so ein bisschen über den Tellerrand schaust, wird dir schon auch einfach nochmal bewusst, wo Deutschland damals auch so seine Spuren hinterlassen hat und das bis heute sich eigentlich durchzieht. Also die ganzen historischen Kontinuitäten, die es bis heute ja noch gibt.
Suzy Hansen hat auch den Begriff Empire benutzt. Ich habe den Begriff Imperium davor schon benutzt gehabt, bezogen auf Amerika und auf das versteckte Imperium, das sich die Supermacht quasi unterhält. Es gibt auch ein Buch, das den schmissigen Titel How to Hide an Empire trägt. Und das bezieht sich ja auf interessante Weise auch auf die deutsche Kolonialgeschichte, ein verstecktes Imperium, dessen Spuren man erst vielleicht auf Reisen durch die ganze Welt so ein bisschen nachvollziehen kann. Kannst du dir erklären, warum es manche Länder gibt, denn es geht ja um Blicke aufs eigene Land und auf das eigene Land, in denen die Kolonialgeschichte auf positive oder auch zunehmend negative Art und Weise thematisiert wird, wie zum Beispiel Portugal oder Spanien oder Großbritannien. Und andere Länder, wie zum Beispiel Deutschland oder auch die USA, sehen das vielleicht nicht ganz so sehr als einen substanziellen Teil ihrer eigenen Geschichte. Wie siehst du das?
Ja, das finde ich spannend. Also wie gesagt, in Deutschland habe ich das Gefühl, dass Kolonialgeschichte ja bisher eigentlich eher so unter den Teppich gekehrt wurde, weil, naja, die weiße Weste gab es nie, da gab es einfach immer diesen Schandfleck des Nationalsozialismus und das hat quasi all die Aufmerksamkeit und den ganzen Sauerstoff des Brandfeuers weggenommen. Und in anderen Kulturen oder Ländern ist es durchaus eher so, dass Kolonialgeschichte schon auch berücksichtigt wird, wobei ich auch im Fall von Portugal jetzt nicht den Eindruck habe, dass sich da so kritisch damit auseinandergesetzt wurde. Also die beziehen sich natürlich ganz stolz auf ihre Descubradores, die in die Welt gezogen sind.
Das hast du schön ausgesprochen.
Ja, ich glaube, der ganze Nationalstolz, der auf Vasco da Gama und dessen Schultern ruht, ist nicht ganz so reflektiert und ich weiß nicht, inwiefern der Portugiese oder die Portugiesin heute sich damit auseinandersetzt, was das für Konsequenzen hatte und so weiter. Also ja, klar, ist oftmals mehr thematisiert, aber ich glaube, so die ganze Wahrheit ist auch dort nicht in den Geschichtsbüchern geschrieben.
Womit der Kolonialismus und das Besitzen eines Empires auch immer verbunden ist, und auch das kam im Gespräch mit Suzy Hansen vor, war diese Idee der Romance of Being Abroad, also so einer romantischen, idealisierten, mit bestimmten Klischeevorstellungen verbundenen Auslandserfahrung, die dann auch darin münden kann, dass man das Ausland gerne besitzen möchte, natürlich. Und das Ganze verbindet sich wiederum für den einzelnen Menschen mit Vorstellungen von finding out who you really are. Wer bin ich eigentlich und kann das Ausland es mir sagen? Sind es Themen, die du historisch überkommen findest oder spielt es immer noch eine Rolle, wenn junge Menschen ins Ausland gehen?
Doch, ich glaube schon, dass das auch heute noch ein großer Teil dessen ist, was es so spannend macht, ins Ausland zu gehen. Weil auf bestimmte Weise kann ich das natürlich auch verstehen. Also ich meine, wenn du wirklich was Neues erlebst und deine sogenannte Comfort Zone verlässt, dann bist du ganz anders herausgefordert und kommst vielleicht ein Stück weit wirklich an deine Grenzen, um dich besser kennenzulernen. Aber diese Romance abroad, die du angesprochen hast, da wird natürlich auch ganz schön viel romantisiert. Also ich glaube, dass das vielleicht mit Social Media tatsächlich was zu tun hat. In dem Moment, in dem man so was Krasses, sage ich mal, wie ein Auslandsjahr oder ein FSJ, was auch viele junge Deutsche machen, dass man das nicht nur erlebt, sondern ja auch gleichzeitig wieder porträtiert für andere, die zu Hause bleiben und die Neuigkeiten erwarten. Und auf der anderen Seite ist es oftmals ja auch ein relativ oberflächliches Erleben vielerorts. Also, dass man quasi ja ins Ausland zieht, aber dann doch eben bei Starbucks seinen Kaffee kauft und weiterhin die Fries bei McDonald's. Und so gesehen vielleicht eben dann nur die positiven Aspekte eines Landes oder ja eher oberflächlichen Aspekte eines Landes mitnimmt, während man so diesen Dark Underbelly vielleicht eher ignoriert, dazu keinen Zugang hat oder sich damit einfach gar nicht abgeben möchte, weil it's supposed to be the best time of your life.
Es klang schon ein bisschen an, aber für einen Menschen Anfang 20 bist du schon wahnsinnig weit gereist, hast wahnsinnig viel erlebt und mitgenommen. Gab es denn im Anschluss daran, worüber wir jetzt gesprochen haben, so einen absolut perfekten Kitsch-Moment auf einer deiner Reisen, wo du das Gefühl hattest, das ist die ultimative Auslandserfahrung, wie ich sie aus dem Reisekatalog und oder Instagram kenne und hier ist Kitsch und Realität in eins gesetzt?
Da muss ich gerade tatsächlich...
Gemeine Frage.
Da muss ich tatsächlich drüber nachdenken. Das war tatsächlich gar nicht mal so weit gereist. Das war letztes Jahr in Rom, als ich eine Freundin besucht hatte. Und wir sind abends, nachdem wir einen leckeren Teller Cacio e Pepe gegessen hatten, haben wir beschlossen, noch einen kurzen Abendspaziergang zu machen. Und sind dann durch das leere Rom gelaufen, das aufgrund von Corona natürlich der ganzen Touristen und Touristinnen beraubt war. Und wir sind schlussendlich 4 Stunden lang durchs Forum Romanum am Colosseo vorbei, am Fontana di Trevi. Die Stadt lag uns zu Füßen. Es war einfach komplett leer. Der Mond hat geschienen und das war eine lauwarme Sommernacht und das war, ich glaube, mit das Magischste, was ich je erlebt habe.
Das klingt tatsächlich perfekt und erinnert mich sehr an ein Buch, das ich letztes Jahr gelesen habe über Sigmund Freuds Italienreisen, der ein absolut obsessiver Italienfahrer war.
Oho.
Darum geht es in unserer nächsten Folge übrigens, ein kleiner Teaser. Und dessen erste Rom-Erfahrung eigentlich ganz ähnlich klingt, also komplett überwältigt ist von einer Stadt, die damals natürlich noch nicht so vom Massentourismus überwältigt war. Aber Italien und gerade Rom so als ein Hort der europäischen Geschichte bietet sich natürlich auch an.
Genau, und das ist natürlich eine sehr gute Überleitung dann zum nächsten Podcast-Thema.
Trotzdem, bevor wir uns schon geistig auf Italien zubewegen, habe ich noch einen letzten Themenkomplex für dich, der ein wenig weniger sonnig ist, aber ich glaube sehr interessant. Suzy Hansen hat in ihrem Gespräch den Satz gesagt, der mir auch hängen geblieben ist: I can't do this. Bezogen auf ihre Auslandsreporter-Erfahrung in diesem Rahmen, bezogen auf Selbstzweifel. Sie hat kurz davor auch darüber gesprochen, dass sie sich dieses Buch, das zweitplatziert für den Pulitzer-Preis war, gar nicht zugetraut hat und eigentlich von ihren Freunden getrieben werden musste, dieses Buch zu schreiben. Hast du das Gefühl, dass es eine Erfahrung, die generationsabhängig ist? Hat die vielleicht auch Gender-Aspekte? Ist das was in deiner Generation, du bist ein ganzes Stück jünger als ich, neu thematisiert wird, vielleicht auch neu gedacht wird? Hast du da so ein Bauchgefühl?
Also ich glaube auf jeden Fall, dass das eine sehr gegenderte Gedankeneinstellung ist oder ein sehr gegendertes Mindset, dass Frauen viel eher sich nochmal hinsetzen und fragen, bin ich wirklich die Richtige dafür? Sollte ich das wirklich machen? In Suzy Hansens Fall finde ich es zum Beispiel ganz spannend, weil die Art von Buch, die sie hätte schreiben können, also Notes on a Foreign Country und wie der Titel allein schon klingt, das hätte auch ein anderes Buch werden können, von dem man dann durchaus auch wieder fragen könnte, hätte sie das schreiben sollen. Ihr geopolitisches Memoir, wie es dann wirklich geworden ist, finde ich ganz, ganz wichtig, dass sie es geschrieben hat, weil sie sich ja primär einfach mit der Beziehung, erstmal ihre eigene Beziehung zu Amerika auseinandersetzt und dann auch, wie Amerika eben dann die Finger im Middle East quasi hatte. Auf der anderen Seite, glaube ich, ist es wichtig, dass wir als weiße Menschen, die vielleicht Absichten haben, irgendwie Reportagen zu schreiben, Wissen zu generieren über bestimmte Probleme oder Aspekte, dass wir uns fragen, sind wir denn wirklich die Richtigen, um das zu schreiben? Gibt es da nicht jemanden, den wir eine Stimme geben sollten, sondern denen wir vielleicht eine Plattform geben sollten? Und von daher glaube ich, dass so eine gesunde Brise an Selbstzweifeln, an Reflexion, ob man wirklich der Richtige oder die Richtige ist, mit Sicherheit ganz gesund ist. Auf der anderen Seite glaube ich auch, dass das primär eigentlich so ein Phänomen ist, was Frauen beziehungsweise weibliche Menschen erleben, weil es irgendwie kulturell ja schon auch irgendwie so ein bisschen anerzogen wurde.
Ja, das stimmt auf jeden Fall. Wir können natürlich das Gespräch nicht beenden, gerade bei einer Person, die so weit gereist ist, wie du es bist in jungen Jahren, muss ich unbedingt wissen, was ist dein absolutes utopisches Reiseziel? Natürlich nach Corona, wann auch immer das sein mag. Also so die Reise, die vielleicht noch nicht so ganz realistisch oder wahrscheinlich erscheinen mag, aber die du auf jeden Fall in deinem Leben gemacht haben möchtest.
Das ist spannend, weil ich tatsächlich eher so der Typ Mensch bin, dass wenn ich mir was in den Kopf gesetzt habe, dass ich da auch wirklich alles dran setze. Die nächste Reise, die gerade tatsächlich noch so ein bisschen auf der Kippe steht, aber die ich unbedingt machen möchte, geht in den Iran. Wie du weißt, ist meine Schwester im Iran und die möchte ich unbedingt besuchen. Nicht nur, weil ich sie natürlich sehr gerne sehen möchte, das tue ich auch, aber weil ich den Iran einfach super spannend finde, gerade in diesem historischen Moment mit dem neuen Präsidenten. Ich finde es spannend, über eine Gesellschaft zu lernen, die anscheinend zwei so verschiedene Gesichter hat, die sie nach außen präsentieren und wie sie dann zu Hause feiern und das Leben genießen. Von daher ist das auf jeden Fall so ein Herzenswunsch, der für mich ansteht.
Also wir sehen dich wieder auf einem Wüstenrave.
Na, eine Wüstenrave weiß ich noch nicht so genau, aber ja, auf jeden Fall.
Vielen Dank, Hannah.
Ja, vielen Dank. Es hat mich sehr gefreut.
Mich auch. Vielen Dank an meine Gäste Suzy Hansen und Hannah Langreder und vielen Dank an euch fürs Zuhören. Am 30. August gibt es die nächste Folge von Kann, Company, dann mit Christopher Castellani, dem unter anderem mit einem Guggenheim Fellowship 5-fach ausgezeichneten Autor des Romanbestsellers Leading Man über Truman Capotes glamouröse und turbulente Zeit an der Amalfiküste. Wir sprechen passend zum ausklingenden Hochsommer über die deutsche und die amerikanische Sehnsucht nach Italien. Und dazu schaltet sich auch meine Kollegin und die ausgewiesene Italienliebhaberin Uta Schröder ein. Bis dahin, goodbye.